My name is Amanda. I'm 45, and I live in a small, sleepy town in Iowa that could easily grace the pages of a travel magazine. Perfectly manicured lawns, kids riding bikes along tree-lined streets, and neighbors who wave, but rarely stop to chat. At first glance, it seems idyllic, but for me, it feels like being stuck in an endless loop of quiet predictability. I'm married to Nathan, a 50-year-old attorney whose world revolves around work. We've been together for 5 years, both looking for stability after messy pasts. He's charming, dependable, and successful, the kind of man anyone would admire. But beneath the surface, our relationship feels hollow, as though we settled for companionship rather than connection. Nathan's son, Ryan, lives with us. He's 24, back home after college while figuring out his next steps. Ryan is polite, reserved, and keeps to himself most of the time. I've tried to make him feel welcome, but he treats me like a distant relative, someone he tolerates but doesn't quite embrace. That day began like any other. I woke up early to tend to the garden. It's my favorite escape, a place where I can let my hands work while my thoughts wander. The cool morning air and the earthy smell of damp soil have a way of grounding me, even when my mind feels scattered. Ryan passed me on his way out the door, offering a quick nod instead of the usual "good morning." That was typical of him. Not rude, just detached. I watched him climb into his car and drive off, wondering briefly where he was headed. Nathan had left hours earlier for yet another business trip. His text came through while I was pulling weeds. "Don't forget to pick up the dry cleaning." Short, practical, and devoid of any warmth. I sighed, slipping my phone back into my pocket. It was just how things were with us, efficient but lacking the spark I secretly craved. Later in the afternoon, I sat in the kitchen, sipping tea and watching the sunlight filter through the windows. I heard the familiar creak of the front door as Ryan returned home. He didn't say a word as he walked upstairs, the faint sound of his door closing echoing through the house. Something about his quiet presence unsettled me that day. On impulse, I decided to check on him. I climbed the stairs and hesitated outside his door, unsure why I felt the need to knock. But I didn't. Instead, I turned the handle and stepped inside. Ryan was sitting on his bed, his phone in hand, and his expression shifted instantly to one of surprise. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us heavy with awkwardness. Then, I realized my mistake. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, averting my gaze. "I didn't mean to intrude." "It's fine," he said, his voice tight and uneasy. I quickly left, closing the door behind me and pressing my back against the wall in the hallway. My heart was racing, and I couldn't understand why. It was just an innocent mistake, a moment of poor judgment. So, why did it feel like I'd crossed some invisible line? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. We ate dinner separately, as usual, but the silence between us felt different. I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, every small movement. When I finally went to bed, my thoughts wouldn't settle. That fleeting moment in his room replayed in my mind, lingering like an unfinished conversation. I told myself it was nothing, a trivial misstep. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Our quiet little town, with its orderly streets and predictable routines, suddenly felt charged with an energy I couldn't explain. It was as though a storm was gathering just beyond the horizon, and I had no idea where it might lead. After that awkward day with Ryan, I resolved to push the whole thing out of my mind. Life needed to return to normal, and I clung to my routines as if they could somehow erase the unease lingering in the air. But normalcy was elusive. The house felt different, as though an invisible thread had been strung between us, pulling tighter with every passing moment. The next morning, I pretended everything was fine. Coffee brewed in the kitchen as I ticked off items on my to-do list. I ran errands, picking up Nathan's dry cleaning, and tried to lose myself in mundane tasks. But my thoughts kept circling back to Ryan, his expressions, his words, his quiet but undeniable presence. That evening, I decided to cook something more elaborate than usual. Typically, when Nathan was away, I kept meals simple. But tonight, I threw myself into making a 3-course dinner. Maybe I was trying to reassert control, to convince myself that everything was just as it should be. Ryan wandered into the kitchen while I was chopping vegetables. He leaned against the doorway, watching me with a faint smile. "Is this your way of overachieving while Dad's gone?" he teased lightly. I laughed, though it felt forced. Why not? A little effort never hurts. He moved closer, peering at the ingredients on the counter. "Smells good," he said. "You didn't have to go all out." "I didn't," I replied, attempting to sound casual. "I just felt like doing something special." Dinner was quiet but oddly intimate. Ryan stayed longer at the table than usual, and we fell into a rhythm of small talk that felt surprisingly comfortable. After we cleared the dishes, he lingered in the kitchen, sipping tea while I tidied up. "Do you ever feel stuck?" he asked suddenly, his tone softer than before. I paused, unsure how to respond. "Stuck? What do you mean?" He set his cup down and leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. "Like, you're just going through the motions, doing what's expected, but not really living." His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I busied myself wiping the counter, hoping he wouldn't notice my hesitation. "Sometimes," I said cautiously, "but isn't that just part of life? We all make choices and learn to live with them." Ryan's expression shifted, thoughtful but intense. Or maybe we just convince ourselves that's enough. I felt a knot form in my chest. His honesty unsettled me, not because it was unwelcome, but because it mirrored something I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. The conversation stayed with me that night. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his words replayed in my mind, weaving into my own unspoken doubts. The next day, I needed to escape the house. I drove to the park and wandered along the trails, hoping the fresh air would clear my thoughts. I watched couples walking their dogs, kids chasing each other on the playground, and elderly friends chatting on benches. It all seemed so ordinary, yet unattainable in its simplicity. By the time I returned home, dusk was falling. Ryan was on the couch, reading a book. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment, our eyes met. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone neutral but curious. "Just out," I replied, setting my bag on the table. "Clearing your head?" he asked with a faint smirk. "Something like that," I said, feeling the weight of his gaze. The room felt charged, like the calm before a storm. I wanted to speak, to bridge the gap between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I took a deep breath and asked, "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for something to happen?" His smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Every day." It was a simple response, but it carried an honesty that left me unsteady. For a moment, I felt like he saw through me, past the polite facade, and into the part of me I kept hidden. I forced a smile and turned toward the stairs. "Thanks for helping with the dishes," I said, retreating before he could respond. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of my bed, the weight of the day settling over me. Ryan was right about one thing. I was waiting for something I couldn't name and terrified of what it might mean if it ever came. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every step, every glance between Ryan and me felt like it carried the weight of an unspoken truth. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something had shifted. The air between us was thick with tension, and yet neither of us was ready to address it. We both seemed to hover on the edge of something, but neither of us could find the courage to dive in. Nathan was out of town again, as usual, leaving me alone in the house with Ryan. It wasn't unusual for him to be gone during the week, but tonight felt different. The quiet seemed heavier, the silence between us stretching longer than before. I had just finished dinner when I noticed Ryan sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine. His posture was relaxed, but I could see the tension in the way his jaw clenched slightly every time I caught him glancing at me. It was as if we were both waiting for the other to make a move, but neither of us had the courage to be the first. "Are you okay?" I asked, breaking the silence that had settled between us. Ryan looked up, his eyes softening slightly.
"Yeah."
"Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might brush me off. But then he spoke, his voice lower than usual. About everything. About us. I felt a flutter in my chest, something I couldn't name. Us. I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly.
Yeah.
About how things have been changing between us. How it feels like we're closer, but not in the way we're supposed to be. His words hit me like a shockwave. I wanted to say something to respond, but the words caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore, or what was happening between us, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep pretending it didn't matter. I crossed the room slowly, sitting next to him on the couch. The proximity made my heart race, but I didn't pull away. There was no going back now, was there? Not after everything that had already passed between us. What are you saying? I asked quietly, unable to mask the uncertainty in my voice. Ryan turned to face me, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. I'm saying that I don't think I can keep pretending that this doesn't matter. That it's not real. What we've been feeling, it's not just in our heads, is it? I swallowed, my mind racing. It was like he had just voiced everything I had been too afraid to admit, even to myself. No, I said softly, my voice trembling. It's not in our heads. There was a long pause, and then Ryan moved closer, his knee brushing against mine. The small, seemingly insignificant touch sent a wave of warmth through me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as he reached up, his hand hesitating for a moment before gently cupping my cheek. I don't know what to do about it, he murmured, his thumb stroking the side of my face. I don't know if I should be doing anything about it. I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch, not sure if I was ready for what was coming, but knowing I couldn't pull away. I don't know either, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ryan's breath was warm against my skin as he leaned in, and for a split second, I thought he might kiss me. But instead, he paused, his lips brushing against my ear. This is wrong, but it feels so right. The words sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could stop myself, I found myself closing the distance between us, capturing his lips in a kiss that felt like a mix of desperation and relief. It was soft at first, tentative, as though we were both unsure if we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But the hesitation quickly melted away, and the kiss deepened, growing more urgent, as if we both realized there was no turning back now. When we finally pulled away, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. What now? I asked, my voice shaky. Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just looked at me, his eyes searching mine, as if trying to figure out where we went from here. Don't know, he said finally, but I can't keep pretending that nothing's changed. Not anymore. Neither could I. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, caught in the pull of something too strong to resist. The days after that night were a blur. Every time I saw Ryan, my heart would race, but so would the weight of what we had done. There was an intensity in the air between us now, an unspoken bond that neither of us could ignore, yet we both seemed to be dancing around the inevitable question, what now? I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. The way it had felt, so right and yet so wrong. How could something so powerful be so complicated? My mind was in chaos. Every time Nathan came home, I tried to pretend like everything was normal. I smiled at him. I kissed him. I did my best to be the wife he expected, but it felt like I was living two lives, one where I was his wife, and one where I was constantly haunted by the memory of Ryan's touch. I avoided Ryan as much as I could, but I couldn't stay away for long. He'd be at the house working, fixing things around the yard, and I'd find myself seeking him out. It was like there was a magnetic pull, something I couldn't resist, even if I knew it wasn't good for me. One evening, after Nathan had gone out to a meeting, I found myself alone with Ryan again. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. We sat in the living room, neither of us speaking, both of us painfully aware of the distance between us that had once been comfortable and now felt suffocating. You know this can't keep going on, I said finally, breaking the silence. Ryan turned his head toward me, his eyes darker than I remembered. I know, but I can't stop thinking about it either. I stood up, pacing the room, my hands trembling slightly. We can't do this. It's not fair to Nathan. It's not fair to either of us. My voice cracked as I said it. The weight of the truth was pressing down on me. I don't want to hurt anyone, Ryan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But what happened between us, it's not something I can just forget. I stopped pacing and looked at him, my breath catching in my throat. Neither can I whispered. There was a long silence, and then Ryan stood up and walked over to me. He stopped just short of touching me, as if waiting for permission. I don't know what to do, but I know I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't just go back to how it was. I swallowed, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. Then what do we do now? I asked, my voice small. Ryan took a deep breath and closed the distance between us. He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. I think we need to make a choice. We can't keep going back and forth, pretending it doesn't matter. We have to decide what we want, what we're willing to risk. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. Was I ready to walk away from everything I'd built? To risk it all for something that felt so right, but at the same time, so reckless? I pulled away from his touch, my mind racing. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can face Nathan, if I can face myself, if I let this go any further. Ryan's face softened, and he nodded slowly. I get it. I'm not asking you to throw your life away.
But I need you to be honest with me.
We both need to face the reality of what's happening. The words stung, but they were true. I knew I couldn't keep running from it. It was time to face the consequences of our actions. That night, I stayed up long after Nathan had come home, lying in bed with my thoughts swirling.
The choice was mine.
I could continue pretending everything was fine, live in the comfortable lie I had built, or I could face the reality that something had changed and that something wasn't going to go away. The next morning, when Nathan kissed me goodbye, I felt a pang of guilt in my chest. But I also knew that it was time. Time to face the truth, no matter how painful. Ryan was right, this couldn't go on. I wasn't sure what I wanted yet, or what the future would hold, but one thing was certain. I couldn't live in denial anymore. The moment of truth had come, and I had to make my choice.